infrahyoid muscles pull the hyoid bone downwards. Acting together with the digastric muscle, the infrahyoid muscles assist in opening the jaw. The actions of the other hyoid muscles that we've seen are evident from the direction of their fibers. Now that we've seen the hyoid bone and the muscles that hold it in place and move it, we'll move on to look at the tongue. The shape of the mobile anterior part of the tongue is familiar to us from everyday encounters. What's perhaps surprising is how much of the tongue we don't see from in front. The tongue goes a long way back and a long way down. To understand the overall shape of the tongue, let's look at a specimen that's been divided in the midline. All this is the tongue, right back to here. The tongue consists almost entirely of muscle, covered by specialized mucous membrane. The freely mobile anterior part of the tongue almost fills the oral cavity. The massive posterior part of the tongue, which is much less mobile, faces backwards into the oropharynx. This structure below and behind the back of the tongue is the epiglottis. We'll see it in the next section. To get a look at the intact tongue, we'll look at a specimen consisting of just the tongue, the mandible, and the hyoid bone. Here's the malohyoid muscle. The body of the hyoid bone is here. Here's the greater horn. We'll look at the outside of the tongue first. The tongue is covered with mucous membrane on top, on the sides, and also here in front on the underside. The mucous membrane of the tongue is continuous with the mucous membrane that covers the floor of the mouth and the alveolar process. There's a deep valley between the alveolar process and the side of the tongue. This projecting fold in the midline is the frenum. On either side of it, the submandibular ducts open, as we'll see later. The mucous membrane over the root of the tongue is thin and mobile. Over the sides and the upper surface, the mucous membrane is thick, firmly attached to the underlying muscle, and covered by projections, called papillae. The largest of these, the valleculate papillae, are in a row back here. This shallow pit in the midline is the foramen caecum. The muscles that form the bulk of the tongue are intrinsic muscles, which run from one part of the tongue to another, and extrinsic muscles, which are attached to bone. There are 3 extrinsic muscles on each side. Of these, the 2 largest, which we'll see now, are hyoglossus and genioglossus. The other one, styloglossus, we'll see later. To get a view of the major extrinsic muscles, we'll divide the mandible along this line and remove the ramus and the alveolar process. We'll also remove all of the mucous membrane from this line downwards. Here are the hyoglossus and genioglossus muscles, which together form the root of the tongue. To see the full extent of genioglossus, we'll remove hyoglossus for a moment. All this is genioglossus. Genioglossus arises just above the geniohyoid from the upper part of the mental spine. Its fibers fan out, the highest ones arching forward almost to the tip of the tongue, the lowest ones running straight backward to the most posterior part of the tongue. Genioglossus compacts the tongue and pulls it forwards. Now we'll put hyoglossus back in the picture. Hyoglossus is a thin, flat sheet of muscle. Its fibers run upwards and forwards. Hyoglossus arises from the whole length of the greater horn of the hyoid bone. Here's the greater horn, and ends here, along the side of the tongue. Hyoglossus flattens the tongue and pulls it backwards and downwards. Here alongside hyoglossus is the 3rd extrinsic tongue muscle, styloglossus, coming in from behind. We'll see it later. Here's the mylohyoid muscle seen from behind. The space between the mylohyoid and hyoglossus muscles is the pathway for the nerves to the tongue and the submandibular duct, as we'll see in the next tape. The intrinsic muscles of the tongue, which we won't look at in detail, run both longitudinally and transversely above and between the extrinsic muscles. They're responsible for many of the fine movements that are involved in handling food and in speech. We've looked at a lot of muscles in this section: the muscles of mastication, the muscles of the hyoid bone, and the extrinsic tongue muscles. Later in this section, when we look at the salivary glands and at the pharynx, we'll have a chance to see how all the muscles fit together that we've seen up to now. Before we move on, let's review the structures that we've seen so far in this section. Here's the ramus of the mandible. Here's the body, formed by the alveolar process and the base. Here's the angle, the condyle, the neck, the coronoid process, and the mandibular notch. Here are the symphysis, the mental protuberance, the buttress, the mandibular foramen, the lingula, the mylohyoid line, the submandibular fossa, and the mental spine. Here's the temporomandibular joint, the articular disc, the stylomandibular ligament, and the sphenomandibular ligament. Here are the lateral pterygoid muscle, the medial pterygoid muscle, the temporalis, and the masseter. On the hyoid bone, here's the body, the greater horn, and the lesser horn. Here are the mylohyoid muscles, the geniohyoid, the stylohyoid, the digastric, the omohyoid, sternohyoid, and the thyrohyoid. Here's the genioglossus muscle, and here's the hyoglossus.